Please welcome Leo Braudy.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for coming. I'm really pleased to be here. I know it's been a week where perhaps a lot of real fears have pushed out the fictional fears that we're also familiar with. Jeff and Kathleen arriving just at the right time. Okay. Let's see if I can. How's that? Okay. Much better. If I can see the book around the mic. Anyhow, so back to fictional fears and real fears there. I mean, we've grown up ever since we were kids on stories of ogres and ghosts and monsters of one sort and another. And we might wonder what is the relationship between those kinds of stories that we're also familiar with and the real fears that we face in the outside world. And that's one of the things I wanted to address, that I do address in the course of the book, too. That is how we take so many of those images from the past and project them onto the realities that we face there. And I think you can see a lot of evidence of that in the presidential campaign that we've all been through. The way in which, Trump as Frankenstein, Hillary as witch, Cruz as Satan. I mean, it's all this kind of repository of imagery that goes way back, and that we instinctually and emotionally feel is relevant there, that really tugs at our feelings there. Really what the premise of the book is about is that fear is an emotion that we all have in a variety of ways. But what shapes fear? What turns fear into shapes that we can recognize rather than just being kind of free-floating anxiety about things? And what I tried to do in the book is to try to look at the history of fear. I mean, this is one of the things that has fascinated me in my other books as well, just the history of emotion. We feel that we have emotions, and we know we have emotions and that they're immediate. We have emotions of love, we have emotions of aspiration, we have emotions of fear there, and we don't think that they have a history. But my interest is really in their history, in the history of the ways that those emotions are shaped. So one of the books that David mentioned, The Frenzy of Renown, is about the history of fame and the idea of aspiration over the millennia, over the centuries, and how it changes depending on what kind of culture it appears in. And the From Chivalry to Terrorism book is about the relationship between war and ideas of masculinity and how they change too. Again, what does it mean to be a man? What is the feeling of masculinity and how it's reflected, let's say, in ideas about nationalism, ideas about citizenship, ideas about war as well there. So this book is about fear, as I've said, and I should mention we're still in the kind of penumbra of a couple interesting anniversaries that happened last week. On Halloween, you may know, was the 399th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, of the moment when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg there. And also that's October 31st, Halloween. On November 1st, All Saints' Day, is the 261st anniversary of the Lisbon earthquake, which took place in 1755. And those two dates in history are significant for me and significant for the book for a couple of reasons. One, the Reformation, the splitting of Christianity, of European Christianity into Protestantism on the one hand and Catholicism on the other, the breaking down of the Universal Catholic Church into Protestantism there, created a situation in which the idea of who really had an access to the invisible world, who could stop demons, who could summon up angels. Could Protestants do it better than Catholics? Could Catholics do it better than Protestants? I mean, that was a real issue there. It was a theological issue, and it was an issue on the level, of the Sunday sermon in these various places. The fire and brimstone sermons, let's say, that so many Protestant ministers specialized in. Now, To me, this is a reason why the 17th century, in particular, is the century of the great witch hunts there. This is in the wake of the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation there, and this kind of combat that I'm talking about. So the idea of who is a witch, who can better determine who a witch is, this is, of course, there are witches before this, there are witches in the Middle Ages, but the idea that the witch is always a malevolent follower of Satan in a kind of worldwide conspiracy against Christianity is really much more. It comes in the wake of the Reformation. It's much more a 17th century idea. And, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Salem witch trials, let's say, in 1692, which is like, the pure American version of this. Now, what about the Lisbon earthquake? The Lisbon earthquake, 1755, as I mentioned, is, of course, a physical event. It happens on November 1st, All Saints' Day. It happens in Lisbon, in Portugal, which is considered all through Europe to be the most pious country in Europe there. And, of course, it occurs early in the morning when people are at church, and all those churches fall in on them and kill them. Something between 10,000 and 100,000 people are killed in the earthquake and the tsunami that follows this earthquake. So the churches all were destroyed. The red light district, however, was spared. What are we, what were, not we, but what were the people at the time supposed to make of this event? What was God saying? I mean, we're still in a culture at this point there where people are wondering, and especially in a pious country, what is God's message? What are the messages of external events? The messages of physical events like that, material events. So some people said, the Jesuits, who were the main religious power in Portugal, said, we're not pious enough. We're not believing enough. We're too backsliding. Other people said, no, that's not the reason. The reason is because that we're trading too much with the English, and they're infidels. And there's a whole host. There's 7, 8 major different interpretations. So this whole question of interpretation, what is the relationship between events in the physical world, the world that we experience directly, and events in the invisible world, the supernatural world, is a crucial issue. Now, we're far enough along in 1755 that actually there's an embryonic seismology happening as well. So, and people are saying, oh, well, it's all natural forces. And this is, why part of the title of the book is it's on ghosts, witches, vampires, zombies, and other monsters of the natural and supernatural world. We certainly have a lot of natural monsters around. I got an email the other day from someone who had read the book and who was a great buff of the Loch Ness Monster and wanted my opinion of what I thought of the Loch Ness Monster. I mean, there's Sasquatch, there are all sorts of natural monsters there. Now, part of the structure of the book is that, a major part of the structure of the book, is that I try to distinguish 4 monsters that to me are the basic kinds of monsters that the other monsters all grow from. They're frequently amalgamated as they develop over the years. But all 4 of them, in different ways, are about fears that arise in the 18th century around this time, fears of the modern. Fears of change, fears of technology, fears of the future in a whole variety of ways. And the 4 monsters are this. The first is the monster from nature. I mean, this is very clearly a kind of Loch Ness, King Kong, Godzilla, that kind of monster that comes up there that proves, in fact, that we don't have control over nature. Remember, the 18th century is also called the Enlightenment. This is a time when people are doing scientific experiments. Well, they started in the 17th, but it really gathers force in the 18th century. They're trying to understand the physical world, and also in a kind of somewhat imperial, perhaps bragging way, say that finally human beings will have control over that material world and be able to turn it to their own uses in some way. But the monster from nature, in a way, says, no, you can't. There is always going to be something in nature that will, in fact, tell you you're wrong. And in our own time, the closest kind of monsters from nature that we're familiar with, aside from these kind of, folktale monsters like the Sasquatch, are the monsters that are created by atomic power. we have tried to unlock the secrets of nature, and nature is going to take her revenge on us. Godzilla, the creature from the Black Lagoon, figures like that. So that's the monster from nature. The next monster is the monster that is created on purpose. This is really the scientific and the technological monster, and of course the prime avatar of this is Frankenstein, the Frankenstein monster. And the Frankenstein monster, again, is a kind of parable of the way in which we think we can control things. We think we can create things that will do our bidding, and in fact, what happens, they turn against us. And of course, in Mary Shelley's book, it's about children as well. The children will turn. We think we can make these children, and they will be always subordinate to us, and of course they turn against us as well. And and we're all very familiar with their descendants again in robots and androids and the cyborgs of the present. The third kind of monster, the archetype, is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and that's the monster from within. Instead of the monster coming from some exotic, strange place, instead of the monster, being different from us, being other, being over there somewhere, the monster is actually inside of us, just waiting to be tapped. And also, that kind of monster is a more primitive monster too, in a sense. Natural, perhaps, as well, the way Mr. Hyde is described in the book and often appears in the movies as a kind of Neanderthal, almost, a kind of aboriginal monster in that way. That is, the younger self of the human race that has been repressed and left behind. Now, again, taking his revenge as well. And the final monster in this group of four is the monster from the past. Again, the idea that we're moving towards the future, we are doing everything, we are great, we are imperial, we have knowledge that our forefathers did not have, and this monster from the past comes to give the lie to that. And I associate that monster really with Dracula. That Dracula represents an older world, even though Vlad the Impaler, who has been claimed to be the original that Bram Stoker based Dracula on, was in fact a Christian who was defending his country against the Ottoman Empire. The way Dracula is presented to us, in fact, is that Dracula is an anti-Christian figure, the Antichrist in some ways. In the movie, which you may have seen, Dracula 2000, he's a direct descendant of Judas Iscariot, in fact. And the vampire of all the monsters, the vampire has the most paraphernalia. It's the most like a church. It has acolytes, it has blood and crucifixes and garlic, and you can't go out in the daytime. I mean, there are more things associated with the vampire than with any of those monsters. So those are the four. I'd like to actually hear all your questions. I wanted just to read one passage about something a little bit different, but connected to this. And this is it's about the ghost. People were very confused about ghosts in the Middle Ages. There was a great deal of belief, but in fact there was a great deal of disbelief as well, especially when ghosts appeared in dreams. Part of the problem was the often contradictory ways the ghost was described, either in theological terms or popular narratives or visual arts. The contrast between just saying there is a spiritual world and then trying to imagine it, to make it concrete. As Dante in the Inferno vividly depicted the torments, fires, and personnel of hell. Thus, ghosts from the 12th to the 15th century were variously described as resembling Lazarus, looking the same as they were when they were alive, in the form of a naked child, as a phantom in a shroud or a white sheet, or as a decomposing cadaver or skeleton, or as invisible. Of course, now it's all the white sheet stuff that we've devolved on, but these are all these different ways. Is the ghost appearing the same way the ghost appeared in life? Is the ghost looking different? Is the ghost looking like a skeleton or what? Leaving aside the apparitions of the dead who appear because they're summoned by a medium or necromancer who professes a special connection to the world of the dead, what I might call the voluntary or freelance ghost often has a very specific agenda, whatever the religious context in which he or she materializes. Now, ghostly gender is another issue that requires speculation, for without a physical body, why have gender, or race for that matter, or any other fleshly distinction? In a Christian or Shinto or Islamic context, such ghosts often appear for purposes of revenge or to complete unfinished business. Perhaps they've been murdered. Perhaps they desire to settle scores with the sinful, either for their own purposes or because they were sent from heaven to redress wrongs. Blood will tell, says the old adage, even if only the killer hears the beats of the telltale heart. But such locally vengeful ghosts also serve, in a religious context, a wider function, and many older ghost stories seem bent on elucidating specific points of religious doctrine, especially about the nature of sin. Ghosts represent an admonition, a warning that proper ritual has not been fulfilled. It isn't so much the murder itself as the lack of a proper sermon and a gravesite to honor the dead. In this way, the ghost serves as a defender of religious orthodoxy, seeking revenge on the living because the proper forms have been ignored. For these reasons, ghosts are often the denizens of a particular place, and now, of course, whole television reality shows are based on recording electromagnetic fields, spots of heat and cold, or ultrasonic sound among the archipelago of haunted spots. Invariably, there is some tale of tragedy or crime that explains why this particular place is haunted, although never why another place is not haunted. And then one final passage, just about this whole question of the relationship of religions, the new religions to the religions of the past, and particularly the relationship of Christianity to paganism. To the extent that popular culture is, as is so often called, escapism, we can reasonably ask what we're supposed to be escaping from. The answer might lie in its ability to simultaneously arouse fears, allay them, but never quite extinguish them. Perpetual battles characterize the modern world. The questioning of the ability of traditional authority to meet new challenges versus the embrace of traditional authority as the only guide to the present and the future. The unseating of the old powers versus the desire to take on the mantle of their legitimacy. The belief in individual will versus the belief in God's foreknowledge. One solution, derived from both nature and the past, was a periodic re-anointing in the primitive. And in England, in the 19th century, this took the form of a Celtic revival, and a revival of Celtic religion particularly. Perhaps more than any other European version, Celtic Christianity seems to be able to weave together old practices and folklore with the new religion, simultaneously hospitable to beliefs in elves and leprechauns, as well as in the calendar of saints. And this is particularly true in Ireland. Now, paganism and Christianity had already merged in the image of Christ as the Good Shepherd, as well as the youthful athlete and warrior. It was an accommodation it was an accommodation that could merge the ideals of the priesthood with those of a court-controlled military society. If any group in the British Isles might be called Gothic in the 18th century sense, it was the Irish, and perhaps the Highland Scots, both groups in which the Celtic inheritance was strong. The Irish had been a thorn in the British side for a long time, and often British Protestantism identified their Catholicism with a kind of paganism. Yet Ireland was not the only part of Britain that preserved something of the pre-Christian past. The English language itself retains a good deal, even though we don't often realize it. God, for example, is the Old English and the Old Norse word rather than the Greek theos or the Latin deus. Heaven comes from the Old English word for edge or sharp stone, perhaps related to the idea that if lightning comes from the sky, it was like the spark from a struck stone. Easter comes from Eoster, the Anglo-Saxon goddess of the dawn and the spring, whereas in French, Pâques, and Italian, Pasqua, it derives from the Hebrew Pesach, Passover. And of course, there are the days of the week: Sunday, Moon Day, Tuesday, Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Freya's Day, and Saturn's Day, the only one with a Latin origin. So our own English language is totally transfused with this sign of paganism. And even hell. Hell is the Celtic goddess of the underworld. So there's a whole kind of background here. I mean, there's so many things in English that kind of push English speakers towards kinds of ideas. I mean, say there is no parallel in other languages of the relationship between devil and evil, say, that we have in English. So this, in a brief way, this is some of the kind of things that I talk about in the book, and I'd be happy to have your questions. Yes?
Actually, just a comment. You mentioned hell and where the word derived from. In ancient Israel, the word Gehenna was
Gehenna, yeah.
meant the outside of city walls. There would be trash that was burned. Since they didn't bury it, they burned it. So that was known as Gehenna, which then became synonymous with hell.
With it. And what about Sheol? What about Sheol? Isn't that another word for the Hebrew underworld? Sheol, I think.
Sure.
Yeah,
I have heard of
I'm not. Yeah. Do you know?
No. But I have a linguistic.
Okay.
No, because I liked a lot of these. I read half the books. I don't know how it comes out. But I like
Who wins?
a lot of the linguistic, the ways in which the language reprises these themes that sort of pop up in the oddest ways. So I like, you have a very nice disquisition on grotto and the grotesque, and then it sort of winds up with Freddy's, with Nightmare on Elm Street.
With Nightmare on Elm Street, with Freddy's Basement and Nightmare on Elm Street. Yeah.
Elaborate.
Well, that's the thing, that is, these motifs, they modify, they change over the time. And, what Jeff was referring to, where does the word grotesque come from? Well, the people were digging on the hill in Rome, and they fell through. They were trying to build a well. This is like in the Renaissance, and they fell through, and they discovered this hill had been covered over the centuries by dirt and trees and things like that, and it was actually Nero's golden house, this enormous palace that Nero had built. And they saw on the walls there these paintings of kind of of flowers and trees and things, and also faces, and limbs and things like that, conglomerate kinds of monsters. And they called them grotesca, because they were found in a grotto, essentially, in this kind of cave there. So, it's in a way, this thing about the individual words, or these linguistically, the way in which it sort of doesn't predetermine us, but it sort of sends us in a certain direction. Our own language sends us in a certain direction. Is very similar, I think, to the ideas of these images as well. These primitive images. I mean, people might have said, of course, cavemen were they sat there and they heard all those noises in the dark outside their cave there, but then why did they create certain kinds of images, and why do we create them as well? The kind of, as I started out talking about the election that way, why do we devolve onto certain kinds of our images for what we don't like? Our images for what we're afraid of come from this very deep history of monstrousness.
Is there a word or a phrase or particularly great or description of the kind of moment where you step outside and everything looks exactly the same, but everything has changed in a very ominous way, but not necessarily everything looks exactly the same? I mean, is that something that you see in the...
Well, it's... actually, we were talking about this the other day. I can't remember whether it's in Kierkegaard, in Sickness Unto Death, maybe, or Fear and Trembling, one of those, one of his books. He talks about Abraham and Isaac. So God says to Abraham, "Take your son up and sacrifice him on the mountain." And he goes up on the mountain. He says, "Yes, God, of course I'm going to do that. I got the knife and everything, and I got the kid." And they go up on the mountain, and God says, "Okay, I just was testing you, see whether, you would obey me or not." And there's actually a lamb in that bush there that's trapped, and you can grab it and sacrifice that instead. And then Kierkegaard said when Abraham and Isaac come down from the mountain, they had seen the trees and the rocks and everything before, and now they looked entirely different. So it's like the God experience, or touching that borderline, that borderland between the visible and the invisible, the natural and the supernatural, that causes that. Of course, that's the positive version of it. Then there's also the negative version, and you just don't understand like what investment one has, in a certain view of reality until that view of reality is contradicted. And often you feel, wait a minute. Can I re-examine my own assumptions somehow, or am I going to stick to the previous view of reality? Yeah.
So then the zombies, can you talk about zombies?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because we seem to move from vampires to zombies, so there's always a fashion, right? The culture.
And zombies, thank you. Great question. And because zombies are so pervasive now. Now, and zombies have a history too. Zombies sort of start out in the 1930s. The United States is occupying Haiti. It had military presence in Haiti, and there becomes a kind of familiarity with Caribbean culture, Caribbean religion, and things like that. At that point, there's a Voodoo Macbeth that Orson Welles puts on, for example, in the 1930s. There, and of course, there's Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones, which is not quite about zombies, but still it's about interest in Haiti. Now, of course, the zombie figures in the Caribbean are black, African American. So this stays that way when Hollywood takes it over. The first zombie movie I think is called The White Zombie, oddly enough. Another white co-optation of black culture. It started with Bela Lugosi, who is going to turn how does it go? I think is he turning a young man into a zombie because this woman is in love with her and he's rejected her. So as a zombie, he'll like her better. I don't know. Anyhow, so this kind of keeps the zombie going there into the 1940s and 1950s. A lot of zombie movies there. There's even a drink called the Zombie, a rum drink called the Zombie at this point. 1960, this is George Romero. If one person changed the image of the zombie, it's George Romero in Night of the Living Dead. And George Romero was making movies in Pittsburgh. It's like really outside the Hollywood system. And part of what George Romero did was to turn zombies into ordinary people. Ordinary people who were just going to come and wanted to chew you up in kind of an ogre-y way. The eat the brain stuff comes much later. Eating the brain specifically, I think, there's a little Alzheimer thing in that too. Worried about getting our brains eaten there. But one of the main differences between the four classic monsters that I mentioned and the zombie is that the classic monsters are all individuals. Zombies are a group. So it's about the fear of groups, and whatever group you'd like. Is it about the fear of illegal immigrants? Is it about the fear of Islamic fundamentalists? Is it about the fear of Republicans or Democrats or whoever?
Or mall shoppers.
Or mall. Well, this is what, it starts out that after Night of the Living Dead, 10 years later, Romero makes Dawn of the Dead, and they're all consumers. It's about a consumer. It's a blind consumer society, and they go to the mall, and they fall into the fountains of the mall, and they try to get into the stores to buy things. And actually, somebody in the movie, as I remember, explains it. Well, because they've been resurrected, it's always a kind of disease. Because there's also fear of globalization. too. It's a fear of epidemic diseases. It's a fear of these kind of abstractions and these groups there. But they've had, in Dawn of the Dead, some disease, they've died, but from the disease, but the disease also makes them undead. Unfortunately, however, they only have an IQ of 25. So they want to go to places where they felt happy. And that was buying things at the mall was where they felt happy. Right. That's right. See, it's all become true. The one interesting thing that's happened with zombies fairly recently is they've gotten a lot faster than they used to be. I mean, in World War Z, they're zooming, which makes them even more compatible with a kind of fear of refugees, fear of fundamentalists, fear.
High-tech fears.
And high-tech fears, yeah, sure, and fears of NAFTA. I don't know.
That started 20 days after, didn't it? Those fast.
Yeah, the fast-moving ones. Yeah. Yes, Diane.
Do you explore? People like to be scared. Okay, so this is like they like to go to. Some people, I do not. I'm not one of them. And so, going to movies, entertainment, telling ghost stories around a campfire is something lots of people like to do. And did you, through history, did people like to do that for different reasons? Or is there a basic reason, like to conquer fear, that everybody always wants to do it?
Well, there are different views. I mean, a lot of it is about risk in that way, and the willingness to, to put yourself in jeopardy, and then get out of it. But here's a line. Actually, it's one of the epigraphs to the first chapter. We love to be at once miserable and unhurt. 1759. So even then, people were talking, and there are lots of people saying similar things, over the ages that way. I mean, it's the desire to be, on the griddle in some way for a while, but not be burnt. I mean, we can see, and it's like kinds of risk that we take in, more tangible ways. I don't know, in normal life.
Tangible is different from.
Tangible is different from the from the psychic. From the psychic idea that you somehow, there's a scene, I don't know, it reminds me, in Moll Flanders, Defoe's novel, Moll Flanders, there's a scene in which she has she's stolen a very valuable watch from a little girl. And she toys with the idea of helping them look for the person who stole the watch. That is, how close can you get to the edge without falling in there? And she gets this tremendous sense of elation, from doing that, from taking that risk.
Murderers do that.
Yeah.
They always report
I
that.
had somebody do that to me.
Really?
Really?
Yeah, I had a tenant who stole from me, who was trying to be very helpful in helping me find whoever did it.
Were you dating her?
My
I was not dating him.
My favorite story like that is a friend of mine in New York lives on 105th and Broadway, and he came out one day to start his car, to go somewhere, and it goes click, click, click. What's the matter? Lifts up the hood, no battery. He's looking down. Guy comes up and says, "Oh, I think you lost your battery. I think I have one that fits that." So, Clifford.
So going back a little earlier to the sort of aspects of language and particularly English and various kinds of coinages of certain things that are with us now. I just wondered, are there contemporary examples? And by contemporary, I mean, the language is rapidly changing, as it always was, but that seems a sense that there's all these new words that are coming out of nowhere because of various memes on the internet and what have you. Are some of them in the sort of horror area that are growing?
I don't think so. I mean, and I would sort of say that the premise of the book is that they're not, in a sense that because they're so deep rooted here, they're deep rooted in folk tales, they're deep rooted in ancient superstitions and fairy tales and things like that, that it's much more likely that instead of coining a new word for something, that you'll just do some variation on an old word that way. I mean, in the same way that the zombies are kind of variation on the past, or they're enormous. Part of what's, and actually the last chapter is about this. There's a tremendous exploration of changes in all of these forms because of the movies. And starting out with the movies, there's so many different, that is, they're established in literature, they're established in writing there, and there's certainly plenty of them, from the 18th century through the 19th century. But when the movies come in, wham, quantum leap forward. There are so many different variations on this. Early Frankenstein movies, early vampire movies, things like that, because the illusionism of the movies really speaks to this whole relationship between the visible and the invisible world. Can you really see it? Is it really there or not? What is actually happening? I mean, is it a fiction or is not? I mean, that line from The Sixth Sense, I see dead people there. Well, we see dead people in the movies all the time. That is the movies, to see a lot of dead people. I mean, not the ones that we see, contemporary ones, but certainly if you watch Turner Classic Movies, you're watching a lot of dead people there. And so this line between the living and the dead, gets really, mushed over by the movies. And the line between the visible and the invisible. Is that me or no? There is an early, the genesis of this book, to a great extent, was in a course that I taught at USC called The Monster and the Detective, in which I went back and forth between monsters and detectives in that way. And there's actually a chapter on the detective in there, which comes after the Frankenstein chapter, because I see the detective as a kind of effort of rationality to come back against the irrational. And say, oh no, it's just a crime. It can be solved by physical evidence. It's okay. The Gothic, the beginnings of horror fiction, is really in the 18th century. The detective starts coming in the 19th century, in the 1830s and 1840s. Of course, Poe is wonderful because he does both of them. He's like the linchpin between them. But you're also getting a lot of people, and Poe himself talks about it in some of his stories, who are interested in detection there. The ways in which the beginnings of Scotland Yard, the beginnings of investigative detection is going on. And the whole idea of detection is to say, no, there is no invisible reason. There is no supernatural reason for this. There is a natural reason, and I will find it. Sherlock Holmes, these characters are like that.
I was listening to the... Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Damien, I think you were next.
During the Inquisition era, minority communities in Europe, they were living in constant fear of dying, at the hands of the inquisitors and their agents and mobs. Mm-hmm. How would those non-Christian people at the time, what category of monster would they have put those inquisitors into? And also, minority communities of today, could you apply that same fear to the way that they view those Trump supporters that have guns and badges?
Well, I think any of the people that you fear, you use a kind of a group of images, to try to understand them, and to the extent that, certainly the Inquisitors are a real fear, but there are also other kinds of, perhaps more paranoid fears in other areas too. And the thing about paranoia is that paranoia is very similar to art, Paranoia makes sense of things. Art has a beginning, middle, and end. Paranoia is, in a certain sense, very consoling. It says, yes, there is a plan, there is a behind the world, and I know what it is. And I'm afraid of it, but I know it exists. So at least there is coherence. It's a search for a kind of coherence, which may not be there. But in terms of the Inquisition, the British Gothic are very fascinated by the Inquisition. In fact, one of the books that I talk about in here called The Monk, which comes out in 1796, written by. It's interesting how many of these books are written by young people. guy who wrote The Monk was 19. Mary Shelley was about 18 or 19 when she wrote Frankenstein. I mean, it's something about a young person's vision of these things. But The Monk is filled with inquisitors and, churches with catacombs and rotting corpses and things like that there. It's very, very stimulating. I mean, that is the imagination of England, a Protestant country, about this, this Catholic world, because it's also set about 100 years before the time that it's written as well. The idea of that fascination, in a sense, it's back to Diane's question. It's about risk. It's about. A lot of popular culture does that. A lot of movies do that. They put us in a situation that we would never actually be in our regular lives, and we're in jeopardy. We're trying to escape from a concentration, whatever we're trying to do, whatever the characters that we're identifying with are trying to do, and then by the end, it's over. It's made into a nice package.
I have been observing very interesting phenomena all around. Whether people are behind the wheel, maybe at a library, maybe walking down the street, people seem to be in a zombie-like trance.
Staring at their phones. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's no eye contact.
Right.
There's no awareness.
Well, that's just another part of the whole look too. One more question, and then yes, Bob.
I was wondering some modern day twist literary and film on monsters. I wondered if you'd comment on. I'm going to give you two examples. Childhood's End, Arthur C. Clarke has the good alien is actually the devil, comes down.
Looks like the devil.
Looks like the devil. And in Philip Pullman, the witches are good, not for bad. I just wondered, is that a modern day twist, or were there other examples where?
Well, there certainly were a lot of good witches in the old days too. I mean, the good witch was, what were witches? To a great extent, witches were a kind of pre-medical doctors, essentially. There were people who knew herbs and flowers and plants and things like that. They knew ways to, there had been traditional ways of curing disease and things. I mean, the curandera now, do a similar thing. And so there were good witches, and then, the difference between a good witch and a bad witch was a bad witch somehow was using those powers to do negative things. Yes, I'm going to, make sure my neighbor's cow doesn't give milk or something like that, so my cow will, be the only one in the neighborhood that's good there. But the difference, the change with the 17th century is that with this, as I was, arguing after the Reformation, is to make the witches into this conspiracy, this cult conspiracy there, with Satan at its head, that is in combat with the church. I mean, they weren't just isolated people in the countryside there. They were actually, and I have to say that there's a certain amount of skepticism about this, even in the 17th century, that people can believe in witches and at the same time say, well, they're not guilty of these things. But the more overwhelming side of it is to see them. I mean, silly things, happen. Let's say, witches meet in a coven, and they meet in a place where they're going to get together and talk about their witchery. How do they get to that place? Well, maybe they ride broomsticks to get. I mean, all these things get kind of back-formed, invented in order to justify this fear. Well, fear is a good place to end. It's a place we start.
In the light of the last few days, there's one observation you make up, was it about birtherism and the changeling?
Oh yeah. Well, I think that's another way in which older ideas are brought, that have an emotional weight to them, are brought there. It seems the whole birther thing to me was saying, wasn't, on the surface it was saying Obama was born in Kenya. But I think mythologically what it was saying was that he was a changeling, that in fact he was a demon child there. And changelings are in fact born of a part human and a part supernatural being there too. Now, I mean, more extreme versions of this, where there was some blogger was saying that, in fact, if you get close to either Obama or Hillary, they smell from sulfur. Oh, and also, yes, and Obama attracts flies. Why? Now, what does that mean? Well, he's Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies, there too. So, I mean, again, depending, when you're hurling invective, let's say, at an opponent there, one of the most effective ways of doing it is to use these ancient images that already have that connection to people's fears. But thanks to you all for coming.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. Don't forget that you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.